Charlie Ray. I'm the Director of Education and a staff scientist at the MDIBL Lab, and I want to welcome everybody on this beautiful day to the ASCO for the 5th of 7 science cafes. Today's speaker, Dana Waring, is a bioethicist. She is the co-director and founder of the Genetics Education Project in the Personal Genetics Education Project, which is part of the Department of Genetics at Harvard Medical School. 4 years ago, I was developing a genomics course, and I needed an ethicist to cover the bioethics portion. And Dana, we can't even remember how we met. It's been wonderful. I'm teaching this week. She teaches the bioethics sections of my course, and she has a lot of wonderful stuff to say. She works in this project at Harvard that brings together many brilliant people, but also a lot of the first adapters of genomic technologies, people that have had their full genome sequenced, people that volunteer for these things. And she teaches across Maine and New England bioethics and some of the issues that immediately come up: privacy, whether DNA samples are ever going to be anonymous, all pre-implantation genetic testing. There's a ton of stuff that's out there that is ethically very important. I know she'll have lots to say, so I'll stop there. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you for having me. I have never been to this spot. It's really beautiful, so thank you for choosing to spend this beautiful night here with us at the Astico Inn, and thank you, Mount Desert Island Biolabs, for putting this together and for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here. So like Charlie said, I work in a lab at Harvard Medical School. We're housed in the Department of Genetics, although I do not do genetics. My background is in the history of science, and we're very sort of grateful to our department for sort of housing sort of the educators and we sometimes bring we think of ourselves as bringing a very sort of balanced viewpoint to the issues that are coming up in personal genetics. We are sometimes, you might even say we are skeptical at times, but again, we're really grateful to the department at Harvard for their support. So I thought what we could do tonight is I'm going to talk a little bit, and we're going to sort of tackle some really big issues, but sort of as I go, I would like to sort of stop and talk with you guys as we move through topic by topic. How does that sound? You can interrupt me. You can say, I don't know that word. I'm going to try and keep it, since I don't have a proper science background, it's actually hard for me to get really bogged down in the scientific details. That's not a thing you need to worry about with me. But I will try. Some of the things we are going to tackle, like one of the things we're going to talk about is reproductive genetics, sort of testing of embryos, testing of fetuses, that sort of thing. I'm going to do my best to use really as precise scientific language as I can. I am operating under the assumption that everyone in this room has a different opinion on these subjects, and that I hope that we can have a sort of respectful conversation, understanding that there are a diversity of viewpoints, and that it is unlikely, unfortunately, that we are going to solve all these bioethical dilemmas in the next 55 minutes. I mean, maybe we are. I don't know, you guys. Maybe we're going to get it done. But like I said, I'm going to do my best to use as technical language, as precise language as I can, and I appreciate in advance your understanding that we are all coming at this from different points and probably have very different personal histories too. I wanted to start by talking about Nick. So Nick Volker is this little kid from Wisconsin, and he was born with a genetic disorder that nobody could understand. And it's literally like he is the first and only person that they have found who has got this particular variation on a particular spot on a particular gene called XIAP. And Nick spent his whole life, this is him at about 2. You can see he's fully hooked up to all sorts of machines keeping him alive. He had lost part of his colon, I believe. It was a really sort of sad and devastating story. And his doctor said, well, you know what? The cost of learning about our DNA is getting cheaper and cheaper. When we first sequenced the first human genome, when we sort of mapped all of the human genes and figure out where they sit on chromosomes, that took 13 years and cost $3 billion. They did NICs for about 12,000. And the thing that's so amazing, you know, when we talk about genetics, we are often finding ourselves talking about all like genes gone wrong, right? But what's so amazing is that so often genes go right, you know, and that I was visiting with some friends out in Milwaukee, and they gave me, this is one gene, the gene, Nick's gene, XIAP, right? And it's got thousands and thousands of these little tiny nucleotides, A's and T's and G's and C's. Nick had one different from everybody else. On one gene, we have 25,000 genes. He had one little tiny bit different from everyone else that caused this devastating, pervasive immunological disorder. Thanks, Charlie.
Tell us what XIAT stands for.
XIAP, it stands for X-linked inactivation of apoptosis, which is a gene that is involved again with your immune system. It's involved with cell death, and what they were able to do, so they found this marker in Nick, and they were able to know, okay, this is the type of treatment he needs. We need to find him a bone marrow donor that we want to make sure that his XIAP gene is going to fit the bill, and it worked. Here's Nick. He's 8 now, playing baseball, going to school. It's really quite astonishing. And this is the dream. Like when people are talking about what's exciting about genetics right now, you know, why are we investing in research? What is the hope? The hope is that it will be a normal part of our medical care, as normal as getting your blood taken for cholesterol. That you will sort of, your doctor at some point soon will have sort of your printout to help guide what medicines you might take. Roughly, somewhere in the order of like 30% of all the prescription medicines prescribed in the United States don't actually do the thing they're supposed to do for people. All they do is sort of work your liver, sort of put your liver into overdrive. So the idea is that with a better understanding of how, you know, what drugs are going to work for you, what dosage is the right dosage. Some of you might be familiar with the drug Coumadin, warfarin. It's highly variable. What sort of how your body metabolizes it. Are you a fast, average, or slow metabolizer? And the hope is that at some point soon that genetic test will be a couple of bucks to help you. So that way, you know, when you start taking Coumadin, they say, well, we'll try this dose. And then we'll see, we'll adjust it, right? A lot of trips to the ER in those early days of Coumadin dosage. And so the hope is this is what we call personalized medicine. That's the idea. There's a couple of other things, though. Oh, well, you know, Charlie told you about PG Ed, Harvard, that's us. We go around, we talk to students, that kind of thing. We talk to anyone who really wants to talk with us. And that's our website if you want to check us out at some point later. So one of the things we do, you know, in these conversations, like talking about Nick and all the things I'm going to talk about, really what we want is to have a chance to sort of have these conversations with people in a setting like this. We would much rather be visiting with you and talking with you like this as opposed to sitting in a doctor's office in a paper gown, right? That's not a great time to sort of have like a lesson in genetics, right? That's a bad time usually for most people. And again, you know, that we are about sort of giving people some tools to sort of assess benefit and risk as they sort of, and we'll talk about some of the marketing and some of the ways that you might be able to learn about your DNA. We also sort of have a secondary goal of talking to young people about careers in science. It's certainly not our primary goal, but we know that you know, that one of the things I love to tell people is that, you know, once medical school, going to medical school is a great thing to do. It is expensive. If you want to have a research track, like if you want to be a research doctor, get a PhD, all those programs are funded. That the government pays for you to get your PhD in the sciences, and they pay you a stipend to live on. Pass that along to the children and the grandchildren. While you drill them on their math facts and that sort of thing, right? So that's, you know, we hope to sort of bring more people into the fold as well. Here are the things I'm going to try and talk about in the next hour. I don't know how we're going to do. Can I ask you guys, do we have any people who are interested in genetic genealogy, ancestry, those kinds of things? Yeah. Has anyone sort of gone down the path of using your DNA to try and trace that history? Oh, you have? Charlie, you have, okay. So you have, did you learn? So one of the things that happens oftentimes when you're diving into these ancestry questions are surprises, right? That sometimes, Charlie, do you have any surprises from your DNA yet?
No,
not yet.
I was disappointed.
I'm not adopted.
Right. I was telling Charlie earlier that my dad, in my family, I got my dad a DNA testing kit for Father's Day, which he totally loved. It was a win, and because genetics lesson, right? I had my DNA tested through this company that will, for $100, help you look at your, health. It'll look at your traits and it'll look at your ancestry. Not my ancestry like my great grandmother came from Italy, but going back sort of further than that. And my dad, who was like an old Italian man, Salvatore, Alfredo, Tomaselli, his DNA came back that he is somewhere in the order of 10 to 15% North African and Middle Eastern. Right, and so this, makes sense, right? Southern Europe, Northern Africa are quite close, but that was not we couldn't have uncovered that story ourselves. My kids are here. My husband. Hello. I was saying, if anyone is wondering whether or not genetics is real, look at the hair, the wearing ravens. You can see that we are, that certain traits do, that the pedigree is strong. So the ancestry questions, right, they can get tricky. Anyone think of how an ancestry question could get tricky, right? Someone else said, right, oh, I'm not adopted, right? Anyone? Anyone have any thoughts on that about how DNA and ancestry could get tricky in a family like that?
I'm 2% Neanderthal.
2% Neanderthal? That's pretty good! It turns out, right, so one of the things that some of these companies can tell you is what percentage of your DNA is Neanderthal. 2%. That's about it. That you can get a t-shirt printed up with like a Neanderthal and sort of be proud of how much of that DNA you carry. That's great, that's really funny. I'm going to have to look into that with my family. I have my theories. But in all seriousness, right, one of the ways that that people, one of the reasons people are so interested in this is, let's say African Americans in this country, right? It's very difficult to trace those roots because of the history of slavery in this country, right? That so many thousands and thousands of people were uprooted and don't have that history. People who are adopted, right? Or people who are donor conceived. Think about that for a minute, right? So that is people who are, there was a sperm donor, there was an egg donor, that sort of thing. Oftentimes that's not something that parents have shared with their children. Right? So when you sort of start thinking that through a little bit, you might start to think, oh, if you say, hey, Mom, hey, Dad, I got you a 23andMe kit for Father's Day, that actually could suddenly be really something quite complicated and quite disruptive to a family or to sort of someone's sense of identity. Comments? Questions? Uh-huh.
What are people using these kits for? Just for fun? Because I didn't see them advertised on TV now for $99.
Yes, you have. That is a brand new thing. So the company you're talking about, so a couple of years ago, when the scientists, sort of the technology really sort of took like a quantum leap, and what used to be something very expensive and very sort of rare suddenly has become more available, more democratized even. You know, it sort of depends on how you think about it. And so a couple of companies, including the one you're referring to, which is likely 23andMe, that's who you used, 23andMe. Has anyone heard of them besides my friends here in the front? Yeah, anyone else? So they are a company that now they're advertising on TV. Certainly if you do any Google searching, or if you ever searched my, Ancestry, or that'll start pulling up ads in your browser. They are a company that for $100 you spit in a tube, you spit, takes 10 minutes to collect enough spit, and you send it off, and a couple of weeks later they sort of send you back a, like a note that says your genome is ready for you to browse. They were in part funded by Google, so it's very beautiful, easy to use, easy to interpret, and they will look at, they don't go in and they don't look at your whole gene, right? Genes, big, long, complicated. What they do is they go in and they look at sort of little markers on your genes that are sort of thought to be statistically significant. Like, oh, if you have a G over here, that likely means that you have got this particular version of a gene. So it's like a snapshot. It's not a full genome sequence. Right now, if you wanted to get a full genome sequence on the market, did I already tell you guys this? No. So the Human Genome Project, 13 years, $3 billion. Any guesses how much you could get one for now?
4,000.
So it's even since they did Nick Volker, that the going rate, like if you ordered like them in bulk, you're a research scientist, yep. $5,000 to $8,000. It's astonishing.
And that would be the same for that stuff.
Yep. 23andMe though is sort of a, like I said, a middle ground in a way, where they will look at, they do traits, right? So they, I had mine done, and they said things to me like, you are likely to have brown eyes and brown curly hair. Right? I was like, is this, oh, wow, did I need to do that? I don't know. But, it had some interesting things like about the traits like how tall you likely are to be. Are you likely to be susceptible to things like, do you taste bitter? Do you like Brussels sprouts or not? There's a marker for that. There is a marker around people who can detect the odor from asparagus in their urine. Now, probably half of you to 3/4 of you are going, what is that lady talking about? What asparagus odor in urine? And then the other 25% of you are like, oh yeah. Yep, I know what that lady's talking about.
But is it accurate, or is it just like a horoscope? Can fit anybody?
Is it accurate or is it a horoscope? Well, that is a good question. And there is a lot of disagreement about sort of how useful is it, right? So think about it. So you're getting back sort of again, a snapshot saying you maybe have an elevated risk of breast cancer, right? Or you maybe have a lower risk than average for obesity, right? So, do I have any medical profession people here with me? Okay. So any guesses on where sort of overall like physician education is around genomics and genetics? It's hard, right? It's tricky. You know that this is moving so fast that, you know, many of the, you know, doctors who are in their 30s and 40s, right? What you would consider sort of an early career doctor in their 30s. This is all like a brand new world. And so there are a lot of questions around, is this really useful? Like, how would I use this information? Certainly if you go to a doctor and say, well, it seems I might have a higher risk than average for breast cancer based on like one little change in my DNA. So who are the worriers here? Who, I wonder, who are the worriers? The people who worry. So that's one of the big questions in this field is, if I learned I'm at, you know, elevated risk for some of these, let's say, you know, common diseases, cancer, heart disease, but genetics is not like predictive necessarily in that way, right? It might increase your risk, but so does a sedentary lifestyle, so does living next door to a nuclear power plant, right? And so the thought is that for a product like 23andMe can like open up a world of information that is not previously available. But is it the sort of thing that you take to your doctor and then like a whole world of tests sort of opens up? Or, you know, that they'll say, yeah, let's pay for all those tests. Not yet. I'm gonna keep going. Go ahead.
Although that is what Angelina Jolie just did, correct? Isn't she was diagnosed, or they did her genome, and she was sequenced to have that aggressive gene that perhaps the mother had passed away from breast cancer.
Right.
And so they removed both breasts there, in case you didn't know the whole story.
Right, right. So anytime the subject of genetics is in People magazine, that gets really exciting for us. Because we feel like, oh, if only People magazine would cover genetics, people would be so much more aware. More people, unfortunately, read People magazine than they do Cell and Nature and Science. And you know, so we were psyched to see the coverage in People magazine. So famous movie star Angelina Jolie, she's 37 years old. Her mother died of breast cancer when she was very young. And so Angelina had, my understanding was she just had, there's two genes that she had analyzed, BRCA1 and BRCA2. And they found that she has got the variant in those genes that puts her at a dramatically higher risk than average for breast cancer and ovarian cancer. Now, if you line up 100 women, and men for that matter, but let's say women, 100 women in a room, lifetime risk is 1 in 8 to get breast cancer, right? But the vast majority of those women do not have the BRCA variant, right? If you line up 100 women in a room who have breast cancer, like who currently have breast cancer, somewhere in the order of 5 to 10 of them will have the BRCA variant, right? And that's so even less in the general population, right? But Angelina knew, right? So she had the marker. She had a relative who had died. Her aunt, right after she made her announcement about her mastectomy, her aunt, on her mother's side, also died of breast cancer quite young. And so what she elected to do was to have both of her breasts removed before she had cancer. And she has said publicly that she's planning also to have her ovaries removed. Again, she's only 37. So yes, but then if you think about it, 100 women with breast cancer, only 5 of them will have this BRCA variant, which means 95% of the people who have breast cancer have it for a reason that we don't have a good genetic explanation for.
Well, but if you had 100 women, all of whom had that marker, what would be the percentage that would likely have cancer?
I think depending on the variant, it could be as high as 80 out of 100 women.
So that's why she obviously elected to do that.
It is. So she knew, and that is becoming, in some ways, like the standard of care. Like this is what the doctors, the oncologists are recommending. You know, they'll say, if you're gonna have your kids, have them. Like don't wait, because we would really like to get going on the mastectomy and removing your ovaries. Now I know for some of you young folks here, I gotta tell you, 37 is really young. I know some of you students are sitting there going, 37, that's old. Like it's actually really very young. Yep.
I'm not 37, but
No,
I'm
me
a little bit
neither,
older,
really.
I'm like 79 just. I had breast cancer, been looking for melanoma down at Dana-Farber. All those people connected with Harvard also, right? Coding and all those, but anyway, I was a candidate for the BRCA2 or BRCA gene, 1 or 2.
Yep.
And because of my family history, just not my mother, because I'm the only, but of all aunts and uncles, on both sides actually, I qualified, and so that testing was done. And yes, I do have the BRCA2 gene. Have had a lumpectomy, radiation, 4 years ago, 5 now, 5.
Oh, 5, that's a good
I still have the
milestone.
Dana-Farber every year for a breast MRI. And my children, anybody that's blood related to me can have that test done free. Because I tested positive. So both my girls did, my son did not, but he still could
Yep.
have
And
it. And, but I'm
right,
not
he
pushing
could,
the envelope.
men get breast cancer. Like all of us have the BRCA2 gene. You've got a
The
variant of
mutation.
it that, right.
Right. So one daughter elected to have, she'd already had 2 children, both, everything removed, breasts, and I elected personally only to have my ovaries. And I'm monitored every 6 months, so I think I'm covered.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing that story. I appreciate that. And your point is very interesting about who pays for this, right? Because, with like someone like Angelina or your family, right? This BRCA variant is very aggressive, right? I think that's the word you use, very aggressive. And right now, insurance has said yes, we'll pay for that. And in fact, the Supreme Court recently took up the question of the BRCA genes. That they have been held by a company. They're patented. A company called Myriad Genetics owns the patent, owns the rights. That anytime you wanted to have your BRCA gene analyzed, it was a $3,000 or $4,000 test, payable to Myriad, $3,000. And the Supreme Court overturned the right for companies to patent a human gene like that. It was met with like wide approval from certainly the BRCA community, because again, there's partly right. Well, a whole sequence you could get that for $10,000, $8,000. Why this one gene for $3,000? How that will play out in business remains to be seen, right? Because part of how the patent system works, part of the theory behind it is Myriad makes money from their patents and they reinvest it in research, right? And so this just happened in June, so it's not clear. The hope is that more people will be able to get tested, it will be more affordable for more people, but really, like the court just decided. So it's still sort of an open question.
It might be interesting to know that the American Medical Association, which in the past has occasionally been conservative, is right on target with this one. And they are right where the Supreme Court is, and they say, we believe that this is correct. Just in case anybody's worried about those conservative doctors.
Right, right, yeah, so it was, like I said, a lot of the organizations, the breast cancer organizations, the American, were sort of welcomed this decision. It was a unanimous decision. Supreme Court doesn't do a lot of unanimous decisions these days. We talked a little bit about ancestry. Sometimes there's this case recently, the Havasupai Indians in Arizona. Anyone know this case? A researcher had come to the tribe and said, we'd like to study you guys. Diabetes is devastating your tribe. We would like to better understand diabetes. It runs in this family, it runs in your tribe. They they granted permission, and a couple years later, a young person from the Havasupai tribe happened to be on campus, saw a poster about the Havasupai DNA, and went and sat in on the talk. And they had not just looked at diabetes, but they looked at things like schizophrenia, addiction, alcoholism, how related people were. That was really devastating in a way that the tribe really felt like they hadn't consented to it. This is a big topic in research in genetics right now, is informed consent. The idea
Henrietta Lacks.
That's right.
So the Havasupai, and what was actually the thing that sort of caught the most attention about this case was their ancestry story is that their sort of tribal ancestry story is that they originated at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. The DNA showed a different story about a migratory path through the Bering Strait. And eventually the tribe was awarded a settlement. It was several $100,000, as well as the samples were returned to them, and sort of like they were like went through like a ceremony to sort of bury the samples and you know, but it was this real sort of eye-opening moment around how you need to think about the actual people behind the research studies. Henrietta Lacks is the most famous example. I don't know if anyone's looking for an awesome book to read, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, you can't go wrong. She is the person behind the famous HeLa cells, which were the first immortal cell line. They were the cells they worked on to find the vaccine for polio. And they took cells from Henrietta at Johns Hopkins that they never asked her. They never explained it to her. And then these cells have gone on, like they're literally the most famous cells in the world, the HeLa cells. If any of you have ever worked in a lab, chances are you worked on HeLa cells. And so Rebecca Skloot wrote this wonderful book. It sort of helped everyone sort of understand, like, oh yes, we need to think about the human beings behind the research and what it means for their family and their privacy, how much we can learn. But we are still learning. And this year there was a group in Europe that set out to publish the full genome, like they were going to sequence the cells and sort of essentially publish the genome of the HeLa cells that, you know, the Lacks, you know, Henrietta, and it caused quite a bit of outrage. They didn't talk to the family. And in the course of that happening, Francis Collins, who's the head of the NIH, and one of the people behind the Human Genome Project, he's the person who discovered the cystic fibrosis markers. He is, like I said, now leading up the NIH, and he sat down with the Lacks family for the first time this spring, and they sort of worked out an agreement around how to go forward using sort of the, you know, making the genome public, because it's so valuable scientifically. And a committee that includes now some of the children and grandchildren of Henrietta have a say in how the samples are used.
They're also getting money, so.
They're not.
Yes, they are.
Well, someone set up
They're
a,
getting it from the NIH only. That's the only group that's willing to pay them.
I had just read today that the NIH is not doing a cash settlement with them, but there's a foundation set up for them. I could be wrong though. This news, I literally don't make my slides more than like 3 days before I go anywhere because it all changes so quickly. I think there's a lot of people who would like to see the Lacks family compensated. You know, Henrietta was very poor. The kids were poor. You know, they were sort of a poverty-stricken family, and many of the relatives don't have health insurance.
Did you pass along this immortality gene to her kids?
Well, it's more about that her cells were the first ones they got to grow in a dish. I don't know if they've cultured cell lines from the Lacks kids, the Lacks family. Does anyone else know that? I mean, they certainly have taken their DNA over time, but I don't know if they've made immortal cell lines. Like, do her kids' cells grow the same way? I don't know. That's a good question.
I think.
But aren't these cells from her particular tumor?
They are.
Not normal cells.
They are.
Right.
But, you know, one thing that I would ask you all to sort of think about is that we share shed our DNA all the time. And like I know with like my kids, you know, I delivered my kids in a hospital, and I am positive that they have, you know, that I have very likely signed a form that said, yeah, you can use my cells I'm leaving behind for research. I don't especially remember that, busy doing other things. But you know, there's a thought that a lot of us have our tissues left behind in the medical system, and we may not be totally aware of that. Yep.
Is anybody interested in using this kind of technology to like enhance our understanding of historical figures? Like could this kind of stuff tell us, like, I don't know, how many African Americans are related to Thomas Jefferson or something like that?
Yes. There's like a whole sort of community of people who they call it genetic genealogy, who, you know, that are sort of, you know, through various websites and companies are sort of building these like pedigrees, these trees almost. And they tell you, one of this company, 23andMe, told my dad we're somehow related to Jesse James. You know, or how many people are related. Oh, you seem to be related to Genghis Khan, like, you know, most of the men on Earth, you know. So there's definitely an interest in that, yes. And there's also, in terms of historical figures, there's definitely people sort of working on, you know, like looking at recently extinct species and finding ways to sort of, you know, put together bits and pieces of their genome to try and sort of bring back a close facsimile. So yes.
Getting back to the Havasupai, did they shut down the research?
They did.
So here we have an example of some valuable research, valuable findings being shut down by religious intolerance. In essence, it's not a Christian intolerance; it's a Havasupai religious intolerance. So there, I see a moral dilemma: is the value of the research outweighed by this Stone Age religious?
I think that part of the critique around about the behavior of the scientists was, or that there wasn't a fully, a rigorously done informed consent.
Understood. But after you get past that, you do have some science there that we can learn from.
Yes, and that's true too. You know, you know, there may be cases where the lax children hold back. You know, say no, we don't want that project to use the Gila genome, right? It's entirely possible. And so you're right that, I know I've read more about the Gila question around that could that be applied to anyone who donated their cells for research, right? Like, this is this really interesting question around the role that the participant plays in research, right? Like, if I donate my cells and then they do some sort of research that I find ethically disagreeable, what sort of agency do I have? Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say too, with the Gila cells, the time at which they took those, they didn't have laws set in place yet. That was before they said, oh, you know, we should really get consent. Whereas with the tribe, it's pretty well understood. They need to be clear. And so it seems, not that I'm excusing the Gila cells.
No, I mean, those laws, they were just sort of coming online at that time. And, you know, they've gone back and they asked some of the scientists who worked on it, and they said, you know, we could have done a better job, certainly. Like, they even knew at that time that they were maybe sort of rushing things a little bit. But no, your point is very well taken, right, around what say do people get to sort of have, and you know, will it sort of hinder research at times? It might. It might. I'm gonna keep going. Some of you might have seen in the news. Anyone see this?
Yeah.
I'm always interested in how scientific news gets reported. And that's something that I would, ask people to really sort of keep in mind, right? When you read the headlines, right? Because you read the headline, researchers turn off Down syndrome gene, right? And we see a little girl with Down syndrome. That to me reads, they turned off the gene in the little girl, right? Like that's what that looks like to me. If I'm flipping through, that was in nature. You know, you don't really flip through nature, but still, okay. But what, this was an experiment done in a dish, right? So this, you read, keep reading, right? Silencing extra chromosome in cell culture, okay. That's really different than in a full-on, complicated living human being. But essentially what they figured out was, so there's this thing called X inactivation. And women have we have two X chromosomes, right? I got one from mom, I got one from dad. If I had a brother, right, he would have had an X from my mom and he would have had a Y from my dad. But I have two X's, and there is a mechanism where the X, my second X, is turned off, silenced. Like I don't have, you know, women don't have both of their X chromosomes doing what they do. And there's this complicated mechanism involving RNA that essentially, the metaphor they use is it like throws a blanket over the X. So you've got one X working and the other one is sort of inactivated thanks to a certain type of RNA. Someone got the idea to say, could we do that in a trisomy? Could we do that in a situation where someone has got a third chromosome? You know, that most of us, you know, you have pairs of chromosomes. Down syndrome, you know, most people have 2 chromosomes on chromosome 21. Down syndrome people have 3. People with Down syndrome have 3. And they use this mechanism in a dish to turn it off, and it seemed to work. In a dish. So what do we, so think about this, right? Like when we think about disability, and we think about prenatal testing, right? And we think about, maybe some of you know people or have people in your lives who have Down syndrome. What do you think?
Misguided.
Misguided?
The article, it's misrepresentation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, they are optimistic that the theory is that this may be about ways to provide therapy to people with Down syndrome to prevent certain things like early onset memory loss, dementia. That's apparently quite an issue for people with Down syndrome. So it's getting stickier. Yep.
But maybe someone might say, I have a relative with Down syndrome. That person is happy, leading a very full life. Why would anybody want to turn that off? Mm-hmm. That person is so, the stereotype is very friendly,
Right.
but that's also true.
Gets into some interesting questions around, like, what is normal human genetic variation? Right? Down syndrome is quite common. It's persisted in the population a long time. I know that for some, you know, one of the things I read about this story is a lot of parents with kids with Down syndrome feel like it's this real conundrum, where if there's a way to sort of improve sort of memory, let's say, or improve some of those cognitive functions, you know, that's a hard call to make, I think, as a parent. And it's, you know, when you think about sort of informed consent and what people with Down syndrome might think about it, this is a brand new story, right? This came out less than a month ago. So there hasn't been a lot of sort of analysis in the news. But it's certainly something to think about when you think about sort of, go ahead.
What would the testing path be before you actually tried it on a living human, whether it was in utero or
Well, I'm going to think about that in my answer. Did you have a question?
Yeah, very simplistic. When you turn off gene for syndrome, how does that affect, or does it affect any other genes? You've got an empty spot there, so to speak.
Right.
Does it affect other?
That's not a simple question. That's a very complicated question. That's like really thinking like a scientist actually around, that there maybe are, that third chromosome is doing other jobs that are not well understood, right? So I don't know, right? And the idea of how you would sort of do this therapy on a person with 25,000 genes who's already had, is a hard thing to understand. I would imagine that this is the sort of thing that you would see started in animal models, mammalian animal models, is my guess. Do we have any friends from Jack's who can speak to that?
Yeah, there is a mouse model for Down syndrome, and I'm sure, and a lot of researchers are working on that, so I'm sure that they'll probably mimic what was done in culture cells and see if it affects the mouse development.
Has Down syndrome become more prevalent? Do you know?
Has it become more
More prevalent? Has it become more common than it? Just wondering if the situation has got, so to speak, worse. Like,
Yeah, it's one of the things that's hard to track statistics on. Certainly as we get as prenatal testing, so prenatal testing means I'm trying to look at sort of the genetic profile of a fetus while the woman is pregnant. That we're getting better and better at that. And there is some evidence, that says that the rate of women who learn that they're carrying a fetus with an extra 21st chromosome, that a very significant number do not continue the pregnancies.
that's amazing.
And so to sort of truly understand what the natural sort of rate in the population is really hard to do. Particularly because women, it's more associated with older women. And women are having kids older and older now, right? Like we are the oldest bunch. Like we are waiting as long as we can wait. And so the number, there's so many moving parts, and a lot of that information is very hard to collect for a lot of different reasons. Marianne, did you have?
Well, I just wanted to reiterate what you said earlier, and that is that part of the benefit of this is that it is in the dish. Down syndrome children are living longer and longer now than they used to several decades ago, or when many of us were children, is because of the medical advances. And if we can learn more about the genes that are causing those deficits, then we can help the children without doing genetic manipulation.
Right. That's certainly true of like cystic fibrosis. There have been a number of really sort of incredible leaps in lifespan and sort of prognosis for children, right? Children that would have never lived out of childhood are now because of the sort of investment in genetic research. But it gets, these are hard questions, and this is the sort of thing that sort of societally, that there's very personal questions at play when you think about things like this. But then there are these huge, broad social questions around like, well, should we make laws? Do we need laws, right, to sort of, regulate how we use some of these genetic technologies? And if we make the laws, whose job is it to enforce them?
Good question.
Yep.
Go back to the group. Will Vic marry someone?
Will
Vic.
Nick. They don't know how long his prognosis is good right now. He's.
But suppose, will he pass his genome to a child? Is that known?
It is not known. I don't know if it's dominant.
But many genetic abnormality cases that the carriers do enter in this country.
Yes. Should we talk about that? We totally should talk about that. Let's see how much time we have left. Oh, not very much time, but okay. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. This is the most sciencey slide So, what you were saying, your point was, for a child like Nick, or let's say a person, let's say someone with well understood, devastating genetic disorder, right? Sort of what, huh? Huntington's. Or even BRCA in some cases, right? There are cases where people will use different kinds of genetic technology to try and make sure they don't pass this on to their children. There's a type of disease called mitochondrial disease. Who's taken high school biology lately? You? No? Anyone want to tell us about mitochondria?
They're organelles in the cell. They have their own DNA. They're passed down through the mother, but not the father. They generate adenosine triphosphate for the cell by breaking down glucose.
You are hired. That was very good, thank you. Right, so the key point you made is that they are passed on maternally, right? That this is why everyone has slightly more than half of their DNA comes from their mom. Thanks, moms, everywhere. For the mitochondrial inheritance, there's about 27 genes in there. But mitochondrial disease can be this sort of devastating, pervasive, causing neurological problems, causing all sorts of organ problems. And in England and here, the FDA this is banned by the FDA 10 years ago here in the States. In the United Kingdom, they are sort of thinking about how they might go forward using this, which is essentially, let's say the biological mother has mitochondrial disease. So the egg, nucleus, mitochondria in the cytoplasm, sort of the juicy part around the nucleus. And the only way the kid is going to get the mitochondria is from the mom, right? And so mom doesn't want to pass on the problems with her mitochondria. So they get a donor, another person, to donate an egg, and the nucleus from the mom, where 25,000 genes are, go into the cytoplasm, essentially, of the other egg. So you've got an egg with 25,000 genes from the biological mother, and then 27 other genes from a donor. Right? And then, so some people call this mitochondrial gene therapy. Some people call this embryo repair. Some people call it mitochondrial transfer. And some people call it 3-parent IVF. Which is the name? Who likes the name mitochondrial transfer? Yeah, I do too, actually. So what do you think about 3-parent IVF? What does that phrase conjure up in your mind?
They're on the front of the 3-parent cases where you take out the nucleus of the gun and put the mother's nucleus in. Without it being mitochondrial.
Right. But this is the one that is like, this is the one that is probably the closest to being given the thumbs up by the sort of agency that oversees this in the UK. So, any thoughts on 3-parent? Is 3-parent a fair name for this?
It sounds like an equal partnership, and the way you described it, it's not.
Right. That's sort of my takeaway on this. That we're in a phase where we're really giving a lot of weight to sort of genetics, right? That when we think about, we think we're very invested in sort of genetic identity and these kinds of things. And to me, to call that 3-parent IVF sort of to give the status of parent to the mitochondrial donor is like a question that I think is worthy of debate. But so this is sort of, in the works. The other one that Charlie mentioned, and what you were getting at, is this idea of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So we're now at a point where sperm, egg, petri dish, right, in vitro fertilization, that at the 8-cell stage we can take a cell off and analyze it with the idea of, let's say you've got Huntington's or something like that running in your family, a devastating disease that, that there's, they know if you have the gene, you are getting the disease, which is a very sort of rare occurrence in genetics. And they pull off one of the cells and they test it. And they say, okay, it looks like this embryo is free of the disease I'm looking to avoid. And those are the embryos that are then transferred to the woman who's going to carry the fetus. This has been going on for like 20 years. Not new.
How is it different from prenatal testing?
This is
Early.
this is in a petri dish.
Yeah, but I don't know, when I think of it from my own pregnancy, when I had prenatal testing when I was pregnant, I guess you don't do it pre-implantation.
Right.
And I suppose that's maybe, aside from the fact that it's IVF, that's probably the biggest. That's not available to me, for example, as for being internal fertilization, it wouldn't be available to me.
No. So, but you're getting at something. And do you want to keep going, or does someone else want to chime in?
I don't know. I ramble for a while.
No, it was good.
I just don't see how it's much different.
So for some people, this is like a technique that allows like a devastating disease that has been devastating a family for generations to end.
Yes.
Right?
Well, only if all of your cousins did it too.
But in your line, in your germ line, right? And so there's huge, there are families, right? These kids were some of the first kids where Molly was born with a particular type of cancer, Fanconi's anemia. Her family, her parents said, well, we're planning to have a second anyway. They used in vitro fertilization. They screened the embryos to make sure that the embryo would be free of the disease that the sister had, and also that the embryo would be a good donor, good immunological match for the sister. So Adam and Molly are now teenagers. Like they may even be done with high school at this point. They're healthy teenagers. The transplant from Adam to Molly worked. And now when you ask people, so who wants to guess what percentage of Americans say, yes, we should do this for fatal childhood disorders? Who's got a guess?
40%.
40% say yes.
80%.
80%.
I think it's much fewer than 40.
1%. So it is about 70% of Americans say yes.
That was you deliberately have the second child to enhance the prospects of the first child.
To use prenatal, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, yes, to screen, to choose embryos free of the disease, and I think there's a slightly less, maybe it's somewhere in 60%, say, and also to be a match for a sibling. But when I hear, so 70% sounds like a lot, right? That's a lot. But 30% is a big number too. And it speaks to me of sort of how divided we are culturally about these questions, right? That yes, you can understand, right? If you think about, you can put yourself in a lot of different shoes in these kinds of stories. And a lot of the objections that people have are strong and real and strongly held, and it's the sort of thing that we are very unlikely as a culture to sort of come to agreement on. And there's a lot of questions still about, there's no question that it saved Molly's life. There wasn't a donor for her. Yep.
You couched it in the words, I think. You said, well, we wanted to have more kids anyway, so we're going to do this. But I think the issue comes up when here's our precious child. We have to save this. We're going to get pregnant again to fix. And then what happens to the identity of that last baby, that last child? What am I?
Are you only having your second sister?
Right. And so, again, this is a hard thing to study, they have tried to sort of look at, like what are the outcomes for the second child, right? And there is some evidence that says, well, they benefit in that they have the benefit of growing up with a sibling, right? Families where a young child dies, right, it's devastating for the family, right? There's a very high divorce rate, all of those kinds of things, that the child gets to be like has this special role in the family. Right, saved his sister's life. But then, of course, there's a lot of other concerns that people have about, Adam's autonomy, informed consent, his agency, all those kinds of questions, and it's hard to collect that kind of information, right? A lot of families who use these techniques want to not be followed up with by researchers because they're done. Yep.
So I'm sure you're going to talk about this, so you can. I don't want to steal your thunder. You can just say, "Oh, be quiet. I'll talk about that."
No, we're about done. So
that's
now
the
we're
flip
just
side
fire
of the
questions at
coin.
me.
If you can use this technology to select embryos that that you don't want to use because of a devastating disease, then you can use this technology to select embryos that have characteristics that you find highly desirable, that you would like your offspring to have.
Like what? What characteristics do you think people would be interested in selecting?
Athleticism sounds like a pretty good one when you get a $250 million contract and now you can play baseball.
Athleticism, yeah. What else? Intelligence.
Height.
Height. Right. Gender. Right. So there are people who have done this for gender, certainly. Some for just preference, but more commonly for diseases that are linked to the X chromosome, so that diseases that boys are at risk of getting more than girls. But yeah, so what do you think our prospects are of screening embryos for athleticism from a scientific perspective? Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs down. Who's optimistic about that? Who thinks, well, maybe? Come on. What do you think? Huh? There's a lot of genes. Right, there's a lot of genes. It's the same with even something like height. Right? Height, they have found 150 genes or so related to height. Each one having small effects across the genome. I tell everyone, my great-grandmother was 4'8". I'm 5'8". How did I get a foot taller in 3 generations, right? We did not all marry giants. I was the spaghetti, right? It was. It was in part the good nutrition. It was in part growing. It was the pasta. It was in part growing up in the United States of America. My great-grandmother had a full-time job at a factory when she was 11. Right? Like that's how it used to be in my family. You had a full-time job at a factory when you were 11. That was certainly not my experience, luckily for me. And the same with athleticism, right? If anyone is interested in this question, there's a new book out called The Sports Gene by David Epstein. I'm about halfway through it. It's fantastic. He's talking about how the best softball pitcher in the world, Jenny Finch? I have her. She throws about 68 miles an hour. And they were curious to say, well, can the best Major League Baseball pitchers hit her? Right? Because their thinking was Major League pitchers are Major League hitters are maybe a little bit different. They maybe have quicker perception. That maybe they see the ball coming at them faster than everyone else, right? Turns out, not the case. Humans are pretty standard that it's about 1/5 of a second for an image to for when you see it to when it hits your brain. And what they did was, so she pitched to them, and they thought, well, she only pitches 68 miles an hour. The best pitchers in the majors pitch 100. None of them could hit her. Nobody could hit her. And A-Rod. Sorry, this is like a Boston town, this is a New England town. A-Rod wouldn't even play. He saw what was happening and he was like, oh no. And And so but what they realized was that the reason that they couldn't hit her was that because it's not just looking at the ball, right? It's not that highly skilled professional hitters have taken thousands and thousands of pitches, and they see a twitch in a shoulder long before they see the ball coming at them that tells them what's coming, right? It's this like 10,000 hours of practice theory. But there's also a thought that a lot of major league pitchers and a lot of professional athletes have better, like more accurate vision than the average. That most, 20/20 is sort of the best. A lot of them have 20/10. 28 is about the sort of limit that a human can get to. Do you think any of them have had LASIK surgery to get their eyes fixed better than 20/20? They have. So has Tiger Woods. So when you think about sort of enhancement and genetic enhancement, right? But so, are you going to screen an embryo for the however many genes are involved with like visual perception, right? Because this embryo screening, you're not manipulating the embryo. You got to kind of work with what you've got. So like if I don't have any fast twitch muscle fibers to pass on, I can't pass them on. So I think the thought with intelligence, with these really complex complex traits, that some of these techniques are not ever going to be the right technique.
Well, that's rather fortunate, otherwise we're going towards Huxley's Brave New World, which is not a pleasant thought.
Right, no, that's not a pleasant
I have a more serious question, if I may. And that is the connection between the genetic information, the medical, both diagnosis and the treatment, going back to Nick's Walker. So he has one little aberration on one particular gene, one particular chromosome. Well, how was this or is this connected with the particular abnormalities he has, and how is that then connected to the treatment which got him over that?
Well, now remember the part where we talked about how I am a historian of science. So I can talk a little bit about that, like we could talk separately about that, but my understanding is in part that it was that they needed to get a very particular profile of the bone marrow donation for him, right? And that's part of why they needed the genetic information to sort of fit these pieces together correctly. But in terms of the actual like pathway of the disease, like why the protein wasn't coding right, then that is something that you and I could email about.
Well, I mean, how did they know that this genetic aberration caused that? I mean, how do they?
Isn't it amazing though that they know? Somebody knew.
Yeah, that poor kid had all these diseases, so
He did.
How?
I mean, it's not, he's not perfectly healthy, right? He still has a lot of sort of challenges. He still has, anyone who has a bone marrow transplant has a fragile immune system, certainly. So there is still, I think there are still effects of the disease, right? That the marrow transplant saved his life, and it is continuing to save his life, but I don't know what they think about his sort of long-term prospects. I mean, they're optimistic.
That's the beginning too. I mean, there he's diagnosed with this multiple diseases.
Right.
And
No
then
one's
to-
ever seen,
to
but
look for a particular aberration on it. I mean,
right. So we can talk about. They have a way about how they figured out sort of. They looked at his parents. They looked at what of his genes are different from his parents. So they did have like sort of a process of elimination to sort of narrow it down. I know we're just about done. Can I take one more question, or should we?
I don't know if you can answer this, but when we go to the doctor, we're found to have some kind of a disease or something, how do we know that our doctor is giving us the right advice or is able to help us with, is able to help us with those connections? Say, like you ladies back here mentioned Dana-Farber. Well, how do we know that the questions we're asking this particular man or woman, this doctor knows what they're supposed to know to get us the best treatment, because we don't know the treatments that are, I'm not a medical person, I
Right.
don't know what's available out in the world.
This is really a great question, and this is a good way to end, is that there's definitely sort of a movement afoot around people sort of that taking sort of their genetics into their own hands.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Sort of patient empowerment and patient advocacy to say, well, I understand that the medical system, the sort of apparatus of the medical system is expensive and complicated and slow moving, and that, you know, that people, that sort of the easier access to genetic testing and this sort of information is sort of democratizing it, and that, you know, there's a lot of sort of talk about sort of partnerships between patients and doctors. But certainly that is, in a lot of ways, the domain of the privileged. Right? This idea that I'm going to pay a couple $100 to get my genome done and look at it on my nice laptop. Right? So I do think there is, but that is sort of the hope, is that the more that genetic information is available, the more that people will be able to sort of become their own advocates in some ways, or become partners, really. You know, that we're looking at scientists now saying, you know, that there's now many studies where there's a real, true exchange of information, where if I give my sample to study macular degeneration, there are some studies that said, and we will give you back your data, your Dana-specific data. Not like, we found 82% of the people are heterozygous for blah, 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 blah. That they will, you know what I mean? So that is something that people in the field are very optimistic about, but the education component is where, like, the rubber hits the road. So I'm going to hang around for a little bit. Thank you very much for